On April 11, 1970, the Apollo 13 rocket lifted off from America's Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida.
And we have liftoff at 2:13.
Carrying 3 astronauts on a mission to the moon. It had been less than a year since Neil Armstrong first stepped on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And this was NASA's 3rd attempt to send men to the moon. With the success of the previous 2 missions, the astronauts aboard this rocket had great confidence in their mission. It was their dream to go to the moon, but they had no idea that it would never happen. In April 1970, their spacecraft was flying around 330,000 kilometers from Earth when they suddenly heard a loud bang. It was a huge bang that jolted the entire spacecraft. A few seconds later, they started to get warning lights and alarms going off. It was discovered that one of their oxygen tanks had burst and the other one was leaking.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Can say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
On the ground, Mission Control didn't think much of it. They thought the instruments weren't working right, but the astronauts on board saw through the window that the air was being sucked out. They also saw that the spacecraft had been thrown out of its way, so much that it was going away from Earth by kilometers every second. In a matter of hours, the Apollo 13 astronauts were so far from Earth that they had set a new record. No one had ever gone that far before. Forget landing on the moon. At the time, the big question was, can they make it back to Earth alive? This is the disturbing story of the Apollo 13 mission. John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, said in 1961 that by the end of this decade, we will have people on the moon.
To achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It's important to remember that this promise was made during the Cold War. It was during this time that the United States and the USSR were racing each other in a space race to see who would be the leader in technology. In 1969, both Apollo 11 and 12 missions were a success. Not only did astronauts make it to the moon, but they also made it back safely. Kennedy's promise was kept, but it had a downside. The public and government's enthusiasm for space spending dropped off drastically. It's no secret that people were thrilled when they first saw a man walk on the moon, but they couldn't have been any more thrilled when they saw him do it again and again and again. United States government had to reduce NASA's budget, and many of the planned missions for the upcoming years, like Apollo 20, had to be put on hold. That's why the launch of Apollo 13 came at such a big moment in space history. NASA needed to show the United States government that space was still worth investing in. That's why Apollo 13's primary mission was not just to explore and examine the moon's surface, but to also establish the human ability to work in the lunar environment. Apollo 13 spacecraft was based on the designs of previous space missions, with 4 main components: the command module, the service module, the lunar module, and the launch escape system. The spacecraft was launched using the Saturn V rocket. The command module is a cone-shaped structure that measures 11 feet in length and 13 feet in width. Inside the command module are all the instruments, navigation equipment, radios, life support systems, and small engines. The service module was the second most significant component, providing the majority of oxygen for the astronauts, as well as additional engines and fuel cells for electricity generation. The Command and Service Module, or CSM for short, they remain in contact with each other throughout the entire mission until the astronaut returns to Earth. Only during re-entry do they separate. The third component was the Lunar Module, which was actually to land on the moon. Once the work on the moon was completed, it was to relink with the CSM module. The launch escape system wasn't as important to the mission as the other 4 parts. If there was an accident during launch and the rocket caught fire, it would eject the astronauts and get them out of the way. On April 11, 1970, after the safe and successful launch of Apollo 13, there was no need for the LAS. There were 3 astronauts aboard the spacecraft: Commander Jim Lovell, Lunar Module pilot Fred Haise, and Command Module pilot Jack Swigert. 3 crew members take off from Earth. There were about 200,000 people on the ground to watch this rocket launch. This was a small crowd compared to the previous year's launch of Apollo 11, which had 7 million people on the ground for the launch. NASA realized how quickly people had lost interest in space. But speaking of the mission, this spacecraft took off smoothly toward its destination. The journey to Fra Mauro crater on the moon took 3 days. The crater contains a lot of information about not only the moon, but also the Earth. During the initial 2 days of the flight, astronaut Jack Swigert encountered a minor issue when he discovered that he had neglected to file his federal income tax return.
Uh-oh. Have you guys completed your income tax?
Yeah, Joe, I gotta... Hey, it's too funny. Things kind of happen real fast down there, and I do need an extension. I didn't get mine filed.
And was informed with a humorous response that he could be granted a 60-day extension. This conversation shows that everything was going smoothly. There were no malfunctions during the first 2 days of the mission. At 46 hours, 43 minutes into the mission, the capsule communicator on board reported that the spacecraft was in good condition and that they were tired of sitting here.
This is Apollo Control at 46 hours, 43 minutes.
Spacecraft's in real good shape as far as we're concerned, Jim. We're aboard the tears down here.
On April 13, the crew is told that they have some tests to do on the Lunar Module. They also have to do a TV broadcast where they'll use the cameras to show the world the inside of the command and service modules. By this time, the audience's interest in the broadcast had dropped to the point where no television network was showing it at the time. Commander Lovell's wife went to the VIP area of Mission Control to view the broadcast. About 6.25 minutes after the TV broadcast ended, the flight controllers on board astronaut Swigert to check the oxygen levels. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was just a regular checkup of oxygen tanks in a service module. But then, out of nowhere, there was a huge explosion. The astronauts aboard the spacecraft were in a state of shock. Commander Lovell reached out to Mission Control and reported, "Houston, we have a problem." It turns out that one of the oxygen tanks was totally empty, and the oxygen levels in the other one were dropping fast. At first, Mission Control on the ground thought the readings were wrong, but it turns out readings were correct. Everyone had to act fast to save the astronauts' lives, and the TV channels that had been calling the mission boring and not showing it in the news suddenly made it the top story.
To the moon is in serious jeopardy this morning and is not going to make a moon landing.
Oxygen tanks in the spaceship were in the shape of a sphere. Oxygen was stored in the form of liquid. There was a heater in the center of the sphere that changed the liquid oxygen to gas. There were 2 such tanks on the Apollo 13 service module. The tank number 2 was originally installed in the Apollo 10 service module, but was removed from the module for modifications. During the repair process, the tank fell and was damaged, but was not visible during the inspection. During testing, it was observed that the tank would not be completely empty. Heaters were then used to completely boil off the remaining oxygen. Later, they discovered that the thermometer inside could reach up to 30 degrees Celsius. When the oxygen tank was heated up by the heater, it got really hot up to 538 degrees Celsius. Nobody noticed because it didn't show up on the thermometer. Before the launch, NASA's managers and engineers had given the green light to the tank after an in-depth review, but they weren't able to see any internal damage. On the 3rd day of the Apollo 13 mission, during a routine inspection of the tank due to damaged electric wires, a spark ignited, causing the tank to explode. The tank was attached to the outside of the spacecraft by chance. If it had been inside and exploded, everyone would have been killed right away. The explosion happened outside, and only the 13-foot section of the service module was affected. What else was damaged? The astronauts weren't sure. Now they had a big decision to make. Which way would they go back to Earth? The quickest way to get back to Earth was to turn the spacecraft around. But to do that, they had to start the main engine in the service module. The service module's main engine was in the vicinity of the CSM explosion. No one knew if the engine was destroyed or not. The second option was to go to the moon and circle around the moon to come back to Earth. The service module engine wouldn't be needed for this option. The risk was that it would take 4 to 5 days to get back to Earth. Did they have enough oxygen or water? The NASA flight director decided to send the astronauts back down the long way.
Okay, here we go. The mid-course correction for free return. Can I have your LEM?
They were told to turn off their CSM module right away and use the Lunar Module as a life raft. It was a safe choice, but there were a few issues with it. The Lunar Module's design allowed only 2 people to sit in it for a total of 20 hours. Because the original mission of the Lunar Module was to go to the moon and relink with the CSM module. But now, these 3 people were expected to sit in the Lunar Module for 4 to 5 days. The Lunar Module's engines weren't designed to be fired multiple times. This was also, to a large extent, a risky maneuver to conserve power and fuel. The astronauts were instructed to turn off all non-essential equipment in the spacecraft, including the heaters that had been installed. According to the plan, the astronauts got into the Lunar Module, and the engines were turned on for the first time. When an engine is turned on, it's called a burn. So, they did the first burn to get on the new trajectory. Thanks to this burn, they made it to the far side of the moon. They were the first people to travel so far from Earth, and this record remains unbroken to this day. The furthest they went was 400,000 kilometers away from Earth. If they continue on this trajectory, they could reach Earth approximately 153 hours after the launch. But this time, the margin was too small. If they made it to Earth after such a long time, then there would only be 1 hour of excess food, water, and oxygen for the astronauts. The NASA team on the ground thought this margin was too small, so they ordered the astronauts to burn the Lunar Module engine a second time. Engineers at Mission Control had done a bunch of calculations to see if the Lunar Module's engine could handle the second burn. It turned out they were right. When the second burn happened, the flight time dropped from 153 hours to 143 hours, giving them an 11-hour window of survival. However, before the astronauts could calm down, there was another issue: the high concentration of carbon dioxide. In spaceships, addition to oxygen tanks, there are canisters with lithium hydroxide that can be used to remove carbon dioxide. If the carbon dioxide isn't removed, it can cause a buildup of carbon dioxide, which can be dangerous. That is why lithium hydroxide is used to make carbon dioxide react with it and form lithium carbonate. The problem was that the canisters in the Lunar Module were only enough for 2 people to live for 2 days. Whereas, in this case, there were 3 people who wanted to live for 4 days. Fortunately, there were some canisters also in the command module. However, the filter in the command module was square, while the filters in the Lunar Module were circular. The experts on the ground were given 24 hours to come up with a solution. Astronauts from the spacecraft contacted them to inform them about all the items around them: plastic bags, cardboard, suit hoses, duct tape. They wanted to come up with something that would solve the problem. After a bit of trial and error, they figured out a way to make it work. The instructions given to them by the ground team. They created a new device that would reduce carbon dioxide levels again. Commander Lovell wrote about this in his book. The contraption wasn't very handsome, but it worked. The finished product looked like this. In this rescue mission, Every detail was carefully planned. For example, the astronauts were advised not to consume more than 200 milliliters of water per day. This is because if they consumed too much water, they would need to urinate, which could alter the trajectory of the spacecraft. That's why they had to survive by drinking very little water. The 3 astronauts lost a total of 14 kilograms in weight. Astronaut Haise contracted an infection in his urinary tract. When Apollo 13's spacecraft reached Earth, the astronauts realized that they needed to burn again. They didn't factor in the amount of cooling vapor in the spacecraft, which caused the craft to veer off course. Commander Lovell performed another burn on the Lunar Module, bringing the craft back on course. Fortunately, the spacecraft was able to make it through the 3rd burn. Even though the Lunar Module was only designed for 1 burn, the world was still holding its breath and glued to the news channels, and they waited for the astronauts to come back to Earth. The astronauts' family and friends watched the event on television. Now the big question was, when this wrecked spacecraft re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, would it be able to withstand the impact of the heat? Would the astronauts make it? For this part of the mission, the astronauts have to go back to the command module, because only the command module is designed to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. As the command module enters the atmosphere, there is a communication blackout. This is normal because ionization of the atmosphere causes radio waves to be blocked and communication between the NASA employees on the ground and the astronauts on board the spacecraft can't be made. Normally, this communication blackout lasts for 2 minutes. This time, it was expected to last for 3 minutes. It took 4 minutes, 27 seconds to get a signal from the other end.
Odyssey Houston standing by, over. Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
The TV viewers were finally able to take a deep breath. All 3 astronauts made it to the ground alive. The command module's parachute deployed and the capsule began its slow descent into the Pacific. The 3 astronauts made it back to Earth safely. Although this mission was a failure, none of the 3 astronauts made it to the moon. However, the Apollo 13 mission did make its mark on history. Several books and movies have been written about this historic rescue mission of Apollo 13 and the courage of the astronauts. After the incident, NASA put in place a bunch of safety protocols to make sure no similar accidents would happen in the future. After Apollo 13, there were 4 more missions: Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17, all of which were successful. On December 7, 1972, Apollo 17 was the final mission launched by NASA as part of the Apollo program. The astronauts on this mission spent 3 days on the moon's surface. This was the last human mission to the moon until this day. Why is that? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you very much.